Welcome back. We're going to read chapter 3 from Anthony Mario Ludovici's The False Assumptions of Democracy. Briefly, a background on Mr. Ludovici. You will never hear about him in the halls of academia unless it's an offhand slight. But Anthony Ludovici was one of these big-brained, possibly galaxy-brained guys who was born, I guess, in the late 19th century and was a grown man during World War I and II. And the debate over when our civilization went into decline is an open one, but certainly the consolidation of the errors since, 1789? That stuff was completely consolidated by World War II, and we are now living in the twilight era of our civilization. So anyhow, these people who lived and were grown in this era before 1945 were some of the most educated and most right-thinking people that our modern post-Renaissance civilization has produced, because they had access to a lot of good education, science, nutrition, hygiene, all these great things without being completely ZOG'd, which is sort of how we grew up. So they have a big leg up on us there. Now, Mr. Ludovici volunteered, I think, for World War I and fought in the trenches. And then he worked in British intelligence. Now, during World War II, he was part of the anti-war lobby. Could say pro-German lobby, or you could just say anti-war. These guys who fought in World War I and realized that killing millions of white European men, some of the bravest guys in their generation, that this was a bad idea. And people like Ezra Pound, who realized that it was essentially all being done to destroy Europe and create something new out of the old. Father Tusquets, quoting, I can't remember who, but the idea is that out of the ruins of Europe, there will be built a new city whose name I'm gonna leave. There will be a new blank built on the ruins of Europe. So, Ludovici himself lived through all these times. He was an actor in it. He was detained during World War II when all those British nationalists and Mosleyites were arrested and detained. He was let go eventually, but a lot of the guys he knew and ran with at those times were either arrested or detained for long periods. He himself was an aesthetician. He was the child of two artists. And he became, afterwards, a literary critic and political philosopher, is I guess what you would call him. And he is today most remembered for, under the tutelage of his academic father, or whatever you would call it, his mentor, under that guy's tutelage, they, I think, produced the first English translations of Friedrich Nietzsche. And this seems to be where Ludovici gets his political philosophy. I don't know if you'd call him a Nietzschean, but he comes out of that mold. He believes in hierarchy. He believes in tradition. He uses the word conservative, but not in the sense that we use it today. He's using it in the sense of conservative, of just being resistant to change, in the sense that you're actually adhering to the long millennia of European tradition. So not traditionalism, as I've heard, for instance, Alex Linder criticized traditionalism and say, adhering to what you did in the T-1, adhering to what you did in T-1, there's no rationale for that whatsoever. Well, if you believe that history matters, and that if you believe that your people created your history, actually then adhering to T-1 just means keeping closer to your own natural position in the world, your natural life circumstances. Give me a minute. I thought I'd already put that baby down to sleep, but apparently not. Now you can see him covered in saliva, which is, day-to-day activity. But anyhow, let's see if I can try to wrap this up so we can begin. A guy named Oscar Levy, who was a Jewish man from Germany, he moved to Great Britain, and along with, I want to say, maybe 4 or 5 other people, including a guy named Kennedy. I think maybe Levy, Kennedy, and Ludovici were the 3 main guys doing this project. They tried to translate all of Nietzsche's work into the English language, and this was the first time this had been done. And this is very soon after Nietzsche died. And as you may know, from 1890 until 1900, Nietzsche was more or less a vegetable. He had a serious nervous breakdown in 1890 after he had had this annus mirabilis, this miracle year in which he wrote many of his greatest works, his later works. He produced all that stuff, had a nervous breakdown, spent 10 years more or less as a vegetable, and then died in the year 1900. So the 20th century begins with his death. And he wasn't famous at all during his productive lifetime, and after he died, his stuff started to circulate more and more. And so then you have, between, I guess 1910 and 1915, you've got his works being translated into English by these big-brained guys. And so that's what Ludovici's most known for, is his work on Nietzsche. But we're going to look at this chapter 3 of his book Against Democracy, which is specifically dealing with equality. See if I can expand this. How are we going to do that? Okay, there we go. Let me pause the recording and then I'll be right back. Chapter 3, Equality. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal, that they were endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." End quote. Thomas Jefferson, Declaration by the Representatives of the United States. And then there's a citation here for that, some endnote material. Perhaps it is only fair to remind the reader that Jefferson was the United States Minister Plenipotentiary in Paris in 1785, and that he had therefore imbibed deeply much of the nonsense that was current in France at that time. Back to the main text. From whichever quarter the principle of human equality is approached, it appears to recede into ever deeper dimness and obscurity, the more hotly it is pursued. What does this elusiveness signify? Has the principle any reality at all? That is to say, is it something that can be realized? Or is it the most unscrupulous lie that has ever been sown as a device upon the banner of a faction? In any case, it seems to provoke very real emotions. Thump your fist hard enough and shout from a public platform, quote, "Ladies and gentlemen, what we want more than anything else today, that which our birth, our common origin, our common shape and stature, aye, even our common spark of divine spirit, most surely guarantees us, is equality, ladies and gentlemen, the blessed condition of equality." End quote. Pronounce the words emphatically enough as your exordium, and your whole audience will cheer and applaud as with one voice. Not one of the assembled crowd will protest indignantly that you have been talking nonsense. Everybody will really believe that your words have some meaning, and a beautiful meaning. We've already seen, however, that a word does not require to have any precise meaning, or any definite association whatever, in order to excite pleasurable feelings in those who hear it pronounced. or in order to provoke those people to energetic action. Is equality perhaps one of these empty, inflammatory words? It is originally a term borrowed from mathematics. The mathematician says, quote, 2 and 2 are equal. This triangle and that are equal. This length and that length are equal. This weight and that weight are equal. End quote. He is dealing with mere ciphers, symbols, or abstractions, and consequently the mathematician has everything his own way. And so long as he abides by ciphers, symbols, and abstractions, we have no wish to interfere. He can carry his egalitarian principle right through the English weights and measures via the decimal system into geometry. He is speaking of pure abstractions, arbitrarily supposed to be identical, and, if it amuses him to postulate equality as their characteristic, nobody cares. They are his abstractions, his ciphers. He can postulate what he likes about them. We have the feeling that it does not matter. It is only when a mathematician, who, as a rule, is a hopeless psychologist, begins to apply the lifeless notions he has learnt in his study to the world of activity and reality. It is only when he begins to speak of things that are not his own abstractions, things that really have an existence known to us, that we immediately begin to feel that he is taking liberties with reality. For instance, if he say that a certain 2,000 pear leaves are equal to another 2,000 pear leaves, we who know that no two leaves have ever been known to be exactly the same, straightway call him to order and say, quote, "No, sir, abide by your abstractions. That statement of yours is not true." End quote. Likewise, if he say that a certain 2,000 cows are equal to another 2,000 cows, we feel that he is taking too much for granted, or else that he should try to enlist our confidence by specifying the precise weight and individual qualities of each cow in the set before inviting us to acquiesce to his assertion. And even if the two sets of 2,000 cows weighed exactly the same amount and were of the same race, we should still feel that there were differences in the quality and supply of milk in each set, as also in the vitality of the respective cows in each set, etc., which ought to be taken into account and which would hardly be possible to estimate with perfect accuracy. But let us think of things which have less individual divergence from the common type. Let us think of screws, bolts, plates, chain links, etc. After these have been made with the utmost care by means of machines, capable of almost mathematical precision, and when once they have been accurately weighed and found equal, both as regards size and ponderability, you would think that you had groups of things, or individual things, as between which you would be justified in postulating the attribute equally. But if you should ask anyone accustomed to dealing with such things, he would tell you that one bolt in 10 or in 20 usually splits, that one screw in 100 or in 1,000 usually strips, and that one plate in 50 usually cracks. Thus, here and there, even when enormous pains have been taken to attain uniformity, marked differences become apparent. What about those differences that are not sufficiently marked to be noticeable until some considerable time has elapsed? Can equality be postulated of no two objects on earth, then? Provided that the mathematical abstracts, or arbitrary identities, size, weight, bulk, and number alone are in question, equality can be postulated. But the moment mathematical abstractions are departed from, it is not only unsafe, it is positively dishonest to speak of equality. For instance, you can say that these 100 rails are equal to those 100 rails in number, in weight, or in length. You could not say that these 100 rails are equal to those 100 rails in durability, resilience, or frangibility. You might say that they are approximately equal in these attributes, or as near as possible equal. But apart from the arbitrary identities or abstractions of the mathematicians, you could not postulate perfect equality. Does the term equality mean anything at all, apart from these mathematical abstractions, then? Absolutely nothing. What, then, are those people who earnestly and warmly claim and advocate equality among men? Men who are so different in their ancestry, size, shape, endowments, beauty, desires, appetites, and spirit, whose very features proclaim their inequality as they approach us. Are such clamorers for equality all liars? They are certainly liars, but the majority of them are probably perfectly unconscious liars. From childhood onwards, they may have heard the word equality pronounced as if it implied a very certain reality, a very much coveted desideratum. Deep emotions over which they have no control, and concerning which they have even less understanding, are therefore stirred every time they hear the word, or see it written or printed, and thus they live and die, earnestly believing that this meaningless principle, equality, if it could be realized, would be an unqualified boon. How the equality is to be achieved, whether by bleeding the too sanguine, truncating the too tall, deliberately debilitating the too healthy, deliberately injuring the brains of the too intelligent, or systematically fattening the too thin, nobody troubles definitely to specify. Egalitarians have a vague notion concerning a still more vague desideratum, and this, coupled with the word equality, that is, utterly meaningless, outside the abstractions of the mathematicians, completes the content of their hallucination. But, it may be objected, the world is surely not so foolish. What men mean when they demand equality is equality before the law. That is to say, that the law officers should regard them, for the purposes of law administration, as equal to one another in their chances of being right. This may be true of a few cases in which the cry, equality, is set up, but is it true of all? Do all egalitarians court equality because at some time or another they may have to confront the officers of the law? No, says the objector, but the law is not merely felt when two litigants face each other, or when a criminal is apprehended. It is felt in the home of the just, as well as in that of the unjust. It is felt in the life of the city, in the village, and in the factory. But it is precisely in such circumstances that the law would be most harsh, if it assumed equality. It is compelled to assume inequality in legislating for large communities. Otherwise, it could not be just at all. The very symbol of justice, a blindfold female with a pair of scales in one hand, is a mathematical symbol, which can have no relation to human affairs, but only to the mathematical abstraction, weight. Quote, "A good law should be good for all men," end quote, said Condorcet, quote, "even as a proposition is true for all men," end quote. Quote, "The capital error of the whole French Revolution," end quote, says Louis Madeleine, quote, "lies in the dogma thus proclaimed by Condorcet," end quote. And then an endnote, see The French Revolution by Louis Madeleine, page 15. The author continues, quote, "He, Condorcet, and his co-religionists, who knew nothing of true sociology, which has its foundations in psychology, here prove themselves still more ignorant of history," end quote. Back to the main text. Yes, but Condorcet was not a political thinker. He was one of the foremost mathematicians of his time, and Thomas Jefferson, whose words head this chapter, was his disciple. The danger to which the mathematician, like the engineer, exposes us begins when he pretends to apply his principles to human affairs. But, continues the objector, although it is admitted that initial equality, as between human beings, or any living things for that matter, is an impossibility, seeing that nature's products are all diverse and unequal, and that although subsequent equality is hard to achieve without believing unjustly and barbarously to all those who depart from a certain norm or standard, that is to say, without bleeding, debilitating, truncating, or otherwise injuring all those who vary from an arbitrarily selected pattern, there surely can be such a thing as equality of opportunity. At this point in the discussion, it is only fair to say that most opponents of egalitarianism promptly capitulate and eagerly concede that equality of opportunity is a genuine desideratum capable of practical realization. At the risk of appearing captious and sophistical, however, it can no more be admitted here that equality of opportunity has any actual possibilities of realization than has the principle of equality itself. It is, in fact, an illusion, rather more complex and more serious than the latter. For it presupposes not only equality among men, but equality of opportunity, two equalities instead of one, and among a class of things which can be made equal only by a miracle. In the first place, it may be assumed without any further discussion that a moment's calm reflection is enough to dispel even from the meanest intelligence the illusion that men can ever be equal. On this score alone, then, opportunities cannot be equal, because, however accurately their equality may be established in regard to a supposed standard man, the moment they are placed in relation to the multitude of unequal men, they too become unequal. For an opportunity is not a thing in itself. It only becomes something in relation to the creature who seizes it. Given an equal means of access to a particular ridge or hilltop, the opportunity to reach that hilltop or ridge is the equal means of access, plus the kind of creature to whom it is afforded. The introduction of an unequal element, on the one hand, the men, makes the other element, the means of access, not unequal as means of access in the abstract, but unequal as opportunity in the concrete. Suppose as much inequality between three men as exists between a hen, a hare, and a hippopotamus. And as regards fleetness and swimming power, such inequality is not unusual between men. How could you devise equal opportunities which would enable all three men to reach a certain objective at the same moment of time, if a strip of water, a high wall, and a ravine stood between the starting point and the objective? You might do it by first holding a rehearsal, in which you would accurately time each man and note his abilities, and then handicap the fleetest accordingly. But unfortunately, life cannot be rehearsed. A life handicap cannot be calculated. Besides, it is to the advantage of society not to handicap her fleetest and her best. As Lord Morley very rightly says, quote, "The well-being of the community demands the allotment of high function in proportion to high faculty." End quote. But suppose our objector replies, "Very well, but that is all we ask. We do not demand a handicap. We simply demand an equal means of access to a particular objective, no matter whether ultimately those means prove unequal or not, owing to the inequality of the men to whom they are open. It may then be asked whether even this equality in means of access is not in itself utterly fanciful and fantastic. Given the radical inequality of men at birth, together with the highly complex arrangement of modern society, with its enormous variety of prizes, it may reasonably be questioned whether it be even possible, not to mention practicable. A large number of people cannot all travel along the same narrow path. Several narrow paths, all exactly alike, would have to be constructed. The accidents, vicissitudes, fatalities that would attend some of the early travelers along the roads, faintness, loss of luggage, sprains, deaths, etc., would either impede or facilitate the way of the later travelers. Thus, in life, the means of access themselves, I'm getting my thing messed up here. The way of access themselves, however equal at the start, would quickly acquire unforeseen inequalities. Let us select an example from life in England. Two boys, A and B, one living at Whitstable and the other in London, are quite unequal in gifts, ancestral tradition, build, and tastes. Nevertheless, it is desired to give them an equal opportunity, say, of earning £1,000 a year when they are 40. The father of A wishes A to have the same opportunities as B, and B's father holds the same view about B in his relation to A. Very well. A, having learned the art of oyster fishing, which is the principal industry of Whitstable, is sent to London to learn to be a clerk, and B is sent from London to Whitstable, after training as a clerk, in order to have an opportunity of being an oyster fisherman. Meanwhile, A's father has heard that B is also studying agriculture at a school of agriculture somewhere near Whitstable. A, after having trained as a clerk, is therefore recalled to Whitstable and made to undergo a course of agriculture, and B, having acquired a knowledge of oyster fishing and agriculture, is sent back to London to learn French, which A acquired there. Ultimately, however, A's father, remembering that a brother of his did extremely well as an engineer, prevails upon B's father to consent to the plan of sending both boys A and B to Armstrong and Whitworth's, or to Vickers. We can imagine both A's father and B's father denying long before we can imagine both A's father and B's father dying long before A and B had had every opportunity that society now offers to the aspirant for success. We can also picture A and B themselves becoming gray-haired octogenarians before they finally settle down. No, says the objector, that is not what opportunity egalitarians meant. They meant not that everybody should have an equal chance of succeeding in all careers that lie open, but that they should have an opportunity of succeeding in life. But what is meant by success here? Does it consist in becoming Prime Minister of England, or Commander-in-Chief in India, or Lord Mayor, or editor of John Bull? In any case, opportunities for becoming any one of these four cannot be made equal. Perhaps success consists in becoming a millionaire. But who is going to determine the equality of opportunity for this achievement? Pulitzer, one of the most powerful American millionaires of the first decade of this century, crawled ashore in America as a penniless fugitive, after having swum away from the ship that had conveyed him as an emigrant from Europe. Moreover, supposing that a boy's opportunity egalitarianism extends beyond the shores of his native land, and he says, I wish to have the same opportunity as the Frenchman, or the Canadian, or the Chinaman. What then? Is there any valid reason why opportunity egalitarianism should be confined to a single country, or even to a single continent? What then is left of this cry for equality of opportunity? Simply the string of resentment which gives rise to it. And this we shall now proceed to examine. What kind of person is it who clamors for this meaningless desideratum, equality? Certainly not the beautiful person, because to him equality, if it could be achieved, would result in bringing him down to the common level. Neither can it be the person specially gifted in any of the arts and sciences, for again, equality, if it could be by some miracle wrought, would amount to wiping out the advantage of such special gifts. The self-reliant, the strong, the skillful, the able, and the desirable in all walks of life are never stirred by this cry for equality, because they look down from their eminence, and cannot therefore conceive that leveling could possibly prove an advantage. It must therefore be the undesirable, the unskillful, the incompetent, the ugly, the ungifted in all walks of life, the incapable of all classes who want equality. And they want it because, looking up from their position of chafing mediocrity and ungainliness, and beholding their more gifted brethren, they realize that equality must redound to their benefit. A moment's reflection would tell them that it is an impossible ideal. Their mortified vanity, however, is stronger than their reason. Yeah, that's a good one. Their mortified vanity, however, is stronger than their reason, and urges them to believe in it, ridiculous as it may be. Quote, "Envy wears the mask of love, and laughing sober fact to scorn, cries to weakest as to strongest, Ye are equals, equal born." End quote. Tennyson, quote, "What made the revolution? Vanity. Liberty was nothing but a pretext." End quote. Thus spoke Napoleon, the greatest and probably the deepest man since Caesar. But, however fantastic the cry for equality may seem, it is a dangerous cry, because it is still capable of stimulating and directing energy. It is therefore still a weapon in the hands of the unscrupulous agitator and demagogue. It means nothing. We have seen that it has only a mathematical value. But until the ignorant, the arrogant, and the revengeful among nature's, not society's failures, are brave and honest enough to realize that the apparent injustice of the radical inequality of man is irremediable and inevitable, until they realize that it cannot be corrected without resorting to the most savage extreme of pro-Christian barbarity. Let's just read this whole thing over again. This is a bit dense. Okay, it means nothing. Equality means nothing. We have seen that it has only a mathematical value, but until the ignorant, the arrogant, and the revengeful among nature's failures, not society's failures, until these failures are brave enough and honest enough to realize that the apparent injustice of the radical equality of man is irremediable and inevitable, until they realize that it cannot be corrected without resorting to the most savage extreme of pro-Christian barbarity, the lie equality. As a high explosive, as a generator of social perturbations and upheavals, as a weapon and a war cry, will continue to give rise to meaningless hopes, and to suggest utterly false claims to the overwhelming ambition of all discontented humanity. There is, however, another factor in this clamor for the impracticable ideal of equality, and that is our old friend, the natural indolence of the weary and the exhausted. If all were equal, no matter how this equality is to be achieved, it is felt that things would be easier. Not only would the shame of the ugly and the repulsive in the presence of the beautiful and the gifted be spared, but the uphill race of the poor runners beside the fleet and enduring runners would also be rendered less strenuous. The ineffective brain cracking of the fools beside the swift and efficient thought of the intelligent would be less heartrending, and so on. Finally, the notion of justice, of quote-unquote immanent justice, constrains those who hold it to assume a scheme of life, according to which all human beings are at least equal at birth. Such people very easily argue as follows. If all human beings were not equal at birth, it would not be just. Quote-unquote immanent justice would be caught red-handed in an act of flagrant injustice at the very portals of life. But this is inconceivable. Therefore, all must be born equal. We have seen, however, that the notion of justice is quite as mythical as the idea of equality itself. Generated in this way, by innumerable powerful wishes, the idea of equality begins to take shape and assume the appearance of a realizable object in the minds of the weary and the exhausted, and without troubling to ask themselves what the merits or possibilities of their idea may be, they are prepared to advocate it, applaud it, aye, even to fight for it, at the cost of all the rest of the world, so long as they continue to be assured by unscrupulous people that it will effect all they want it to effect. So far, then, it has been impossible to trace any substantial measure of reality behind this notion and this cry of equality. Is it conceivable that a word should give rise to such intense feelings and yet bear no relation whatever to practical life? Was President Jefferson raving when he, following the lead of almost 30 millions of French people, also spoke of equality as a desideratum that could be gravely and confidently placed on a political program? For it seems only fair to presume that he could not have been serious when he maintained that all men were created equal. It is possible that at the end of the 18th century, equality as a cry had a very definite meaning. It probably meant, in its best and most rational interpretation, that every citizen had an equal right to have his interests safeguarded by the laws of his society, that is to say, by the government of his country. This was not recognized as a principle by the rulers of France before the Revolution, and it is at least conceivable that the substantial reality behind this cry for equality was precisely the demand on the part of all that each man's interests should be protected with equal vigor and conscientiousness by the state. But in this sense, has the cry for equality any meaning? Insofar as certain sections of the community may still believe that their interest is not so perfectly safeguarded as that of the other sections, the cry for equality of treatment has as much meaning today as it had in the last years of the 19th century. But beyond this one claim, it is difficult to discover any meaning in it whatsoever. Unfortunately, however, this very necessary and incontrovertible limitation of the idea of equality is not likely to deter those whose base purpose may be best served by extending the significance of the word beyond its proper bounds, when appealing to the least desirable elements in every nation, and unless, in the mass of the people of all countries, there is an understanding of the term which alone bears any resemblance to reality, mankind will continue at intervals to be incited to energetic, though fruitless violence in the pursuit of a phantom which can have no practical or effective existence outside the calculations of a mathematician's brain. Thank you for your time.